The cold morning haze hung over the forward airstrip like a curtain of ghostly smoke, swallowing the silhouettes of the P-40s lined along the muddy field. Mechanics moved with stiff urgency, their hands raw from the endless cycle of patchwork repairs. Among them was Corporal Everett Hayes, a quiet, farm-bred technician whose hands were better known for baling wire and broken tractors than military precision. To most pilots, he was invisible, until the morning one fighter refused to start just minutes before a mission that could decide whether their unit lived through the day. As the first sirens wailed across the camp, warning of incoming enemy fighters, Everett leaned into the dead P-40's fuselage, listening to the lifeless clunk of its ignition system. An electrical fault had killed the starter relay, an unfixable issue in the field, according to the manuals stacked neatly inside the maintenance hut. But Everett didn't read manuals. He trusted instinct, forging repairs from whatever metal scraps and tools he could fit in his pockets. Time bled away as he ripped open a side panel and stared at the bird's dark, tangled nerves. The pilot, Lieutenant Mason Briggs, paced nearby in disbelief. His aircraft was supposed to lead the formation. Without it, the squadron's firepower and cohesion would collapse. Everett felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders like wet sand. With enemy aircraft minutes away, he reached for the simplest thing he owned, a coil of thin, cheap baling wire he carried everywhere. It was all he had, and it would have to be enough. The early wind sweeping across the strip carried the faint thrum of distant engines, enemy engines. Pilots scrambled to their cockpits, yelling over one another as ground crews sprinted between fuel hoses and ammunition belts. Everett ignored the chaos, focusing on the small, corroded relay buried under a web of cables. He gently tapped it, listening for a response, but the machine stayed silent. The pilot shouted again that they had no time, but Everett barely heard him through the pounding in his ears. He flipped the relay over and found the problem. A broken contact that refused to latch. A new part would take days, maybe weeks, and they had minutes. He pulled the coil of wire from his pocket, stripped it down with his teeth, and threaded it through the relay with farm-hardened fingers. The method was crude, a patchwork contraption nobody in the Air Corps would approve. But on a farm, he'd kept dying engines alive with worse solutions. The fighter groaned as he tightened the makeshift fix into place. When he shouted for the pilot to try again, Briggs hesitated, staring at the open panel and tangled wire. It looked ridiculous, desperate, impossible. Still, he hit the starter. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the engine coughed, sputtered, and finally roared to life, the propellers slicing the air with explosive force. The ground crew turned in disbelief as the dead fighter suddenly shuddered awake, ready for combat. Briggs taxied out, still stunned that the machine was running at all. Everett slapped the panel shut and jumped out of the way, the prop wash blasting dust into his eyes. The rest of the squadron was already beginning its takeoff roll, engines screaming as they clawed into the sky. If Briggs didn't join them now, he'd be left behind, and the formation would be exposed. The fighter accelerated, bouncing violently along the rough, improvised runway, its wheels smashing through puddles from last night's rain. The men watching held their breath, waiting for the wire fix to fail. Briggs pulled back on the stick, and the P-40 lifted into the shimmering air, trailing the squadron as they climbed toward the incoming enemy formation. Everett exhaled slowly, hands shaking from adrenaline. Above the treetops, Briggs felt the fighter responding, rough around the edges, temperamental, but alive. The repaired circuit hummed beneath his feet like a stubborn old tractor. Far below him, Everett watched until the plane became a black speck swallowed by clouds, hoping the wire he tied together in panic would hold long enough for the pilot to return alive. As the squadron neared the designated intercept point, the enemy formation materialized through the haze, dozens of fighters flying in tight, predatory lines. Briggs tightened his grip on the controls. The slightest electrical hiccup would cause the engine to sputter, stall, or die outright. But the plane kept climbing, its patched circuit buzzing faintly but faithfully. The radio crackled as the squadron leader issued attack orders. Briggs pushed the throttle forward, feeling the aircraft surge. He was still behind the formation, but alive and airborne, something that had seemed impossible just minutes earlier. The first enemy fighters dove toward them, sunlight flashing across their canopies in sharp streaks. Briggs rolled sharply, banking into the combat zone with his wingmen. The patched relay shivered under the strain of every sudden maneuver. The pilot whispered a quiet thanks to the unknown mechanic who had pulled life out of dead wires and a lifeless relay. The battle was about to begin, and his fighter, against all odds, was ready. The sky erupted into spirals of black smoke as both sides clashed in a whirl of tracers and roaring engines. Briggs dove beneath an enemy fighter, pulling hard on the stick as bullets tore through the air where he'd been seconds earlier. The engine roared with uneven rhythm, threatening to stutter with every violent maneuver, but the wire fix held firm. He climbed sharply, positioning himself behind another enemy fighter. Sweat poured down his forehead as he steadied his aim, squeezing the trigger. The guns rattled violently, sending a stream of fire that ripped into the enemy plane's fuselage. It burst into flames, spiraling down in a trail of orange smoke. As he pulled out of the dive, the P-40 shuddered violently. Briggs's heart stopped. Had the relay failed? But the engine caught again, coughing before stabilizing. The wire was still holding. For now. On the ground, Everett listened to the distant thunder of aerial combat, each echo shaking the loose windows of the maintenance hut. He paced back and forth, replaying the fix in his mind, terrified he had overlooked something. If the wire snapped mid-flight, if the contact slipped, if the vibration shook it loose, Briggs would fall from the sky. He leaned over another aircraft but couldn't focus, his hands trembling. Other mechanics threw occasional glances his way. They had seen what he did. Nobody said a word, but the silence carried weight, admiration mixed with fear of what might happen. Minutes turned to hours. The sky above the field remained empty, the fate of the squadron unknown. Everett waited, every second feeling like an eternity stretched thin. In the chaos of the air battle, Briggs's engine faltered again during a steep climb. Warning lights flickered. He smacked the dashboard with the heel of his hand, but the only thing keeping the engine running was the thin wire twisted around that fragile relay. He leveled out, breathing through the panic as he scanned the sky. Two enemy fighters dove toward him from above. Briggs forced the plane into a low roll and dove, the P-40 howling in protest. The G-forces pressed him deep into his seat as tracers streaked past his canopy in bright orange lines. The patched relay buzzed angrily beneath him, but it held. Miraculously, it held. He yanked back on the stick, gaining altitude behind the attackers. With a steady squeeze, he fired again, shredding the tail of the nearest fighter. The second enemy pilot peeled away, unwilling to die in a machine being hunted by a plane that should have been dead on the ground. The battle thinned as surviving enemy fighters retreated, smoke trailing behind them like long gray ribbons. Briggs circled the area, scanning for any remaining threats. His fuel was dangerously low, and the engine was running on borrowed time. The relay sparked once, producing a faint burning smell, but the engine continued to run. He turned toward home, descending through a blanket of low clouds that glowed orange from distant fires burning in the hills. Every bump of turbulence made him wince, expecting the engine to cut out. But the plane pushed on, stubborn and alive. As he neared the airstrip, smoke rose from the damaged base. Something had happened while they were away. Another attack, perhaps. But he had no time to worry. The patched relay was seconds from giving out. On the ground, Everett froze when he heard the distant whine of an approaching engine. Regardless of whether it was theirs or the enemy's, he sprinted out onto the open field with other mechanics. One by one, returning fighters broke through the haze, smoking, shot up, limping home. Then he saw it. Briggs' P-40, wobbling through the air like a wounded bird. Everett shouted for the others to clear the runway as the plane descended, its wheels grazing the ground with a violent jolt. Dust and mud exploded around it as Briggs fought to keep the plane steady. The engine sputtered, coughed, then fell silent the moment the plane rolled to a stop. The relay had finally given out. But by then, it no longer mattered. He had made it home. Briggs climbed out of the cockpit, legs weak, uniform drenched in sweat. Around him, pilots and mechanics stared in disbelief as they realized what had happened. He had flown the entire battle with a temporary fix held together by a sliver of wire. He pulled off his helmet, searching for Everett through the gathering crowd. When he found him, Briggs didn't speak at first. He simply reached out and gripped Everett's hand, shaking it with the kind of gratitude words could never carry. Everett looked at the plane, its engine compartment still smoking faintly, and felt a wave of relief crash over him. The squadron commander approached, listening carefully as Briggs explained the makeshift repair that had kept the fighter alive. The commander raised an eyebrow, a mix of amazement and disbelief on his face. Everett braced for reprimand, but none came. Instead, the commander asked Everett to recreate exactly what he had done. Word spread across the camp that one mechanic had kept a fighter airborne with nothing but baling wire and stubborn determination. Other mechanics gathered around the opened panel as Everett worked, demonstrating how the wire bridged a broken contact no one had noticed earlier. They studied the repair like students watching a master craftsman. Everett's hands moved steady now, fear replaced with pride. The fix would be replaced with proper parts soon enough. But for that morning, for that battle, his improvisation had been the difference between life and death. Briggs leaned against the wing of his fighter, listening to the explanation. He glanced at Everett with newfound respect. The mechanic who once blended into the background was now the man who had saved his life. As the sun sank behind the hills, painting the airstrip in deep shades of amber, Everett walked alone toward the maintenance hut. His body ached from hours of stress, and his uniform was still covered in dirt and engine grease. But he carried himself differently now. No longer the quiet farm boy who hid behind piles of spare parts. Pilots passed him with nods of acknowledgement, and mechanics stopped to ask him where he learned to do such things. He simply shrugged, saying he grew up fixing what couldn't be fixed, using whatever was lying around. On a farm, he said, you don't throw things away. You find a way to make them work. Briggs found him again near sunset and thanked him once more. That wire of yours, he said, did more than bring the plane back to life. It brought me back, too. Everett looked away, embarrassed, but inside, a slow, quiet pride began to grow. In the weeks that followed, the story of the wire fix spread beyond the unit. Pilots from nearby squadrons came by to meet the mechanic who had kept a fighter alive with nothing more than instinct and a piece of scrap metal. Everett didn't seek attention, but the tale carried on its own, passed from camp to camp like a whispered legend of battlefield ingenuity. Briggs continued flying, and every time he passed Everett on the airstrip, he tapped the side of his aircraft in silent acknowledgement of the man who had once resurrected it. The two formed an unspoken bond, pilot and mechanic, linked by a moment of necessity and courage neither would ever forget. Long after the proper replacement parts arrived, the original baling wire remained on a small workbench shelf, kept as a reminder. Sometimes the smallest, simplest fix can change the course of a battle and save a life.